Welcome to this. Yes, welcome to the first regular meeting of the Center for World Christianity, which I'm standing closer to the camera because this is being the camera and the recording mechanism, because this is being recorded. So that means that your talk, the talk of our presenter John Newton, will be available as a recorded session on YouTube, and will be yes, you'll be famous.
To mind what I say.
Anyway, I don't want to talk very long. Those of you who are familiar with the Aid to the Church in Need, the name of our speaker will be a very familiar one. The organization, the charity, is very much has been around. That actually, I don't know, 30 years or
1947.
1947. Okay, then I will take it from you. But the last 30 years, I've been following the activities and of the charity, and I think they are most noble. So it's it concentrates on organizations who on churches who are directly experiencing persecution. Of course, it's the Cold War. Yes, that's where it comes from. That's the history, and it's they looked after churches that were suffering from Soviet persecution, Soviet era persecutions, and then after the end of the Soviet era, all types of persecutions and oppression, of which there's no shortage. So today we'll be hearing about one concrete example, and that will take us to Africa. At this point, I would like to pass the word straight over to you, John, and then please continue.
Thank you very much for your most kind introduction and description of the work of Aid to the Church in Need.
Look at the camera and at our audience. Yes.
So the title of the paper this evening is Attacks on Christians in Nigeria and the Problem of Narratives. To give a brief overview, climate change is often presented as the key driver of the crisis in Nigeria's Middle Belt, which has led to more than 300,000 people being displaced and 10,000 dead. The figures are probably higher. Those are historic from a couple of years ago. Narratives used by a number of different groups present this as the outcome of ongoing clashes between transhumant Fulani cattle herders on one hand and largely Christian settled farmers on the other hand over natural resources, particularly land. Christian survivors of attacks are often angered by such narratives, instead stressing an ostensibly religious dimension to the violence which they suffered. Now, this paper will look at the narrative that climate change is the key driver. It will attempt to contextualize it and ultimately problematize it, at least as it occurs in its populist form. I'd like to start with a quote. Tell me, how does climate change drive someone to hack a person to death with a machete? That was the rhetorical question posed by the Reverend Remigius Iluia, the director of Makurdi Roman Catholic Diocese Foundation for Justice, Development and Peace during a visit to the USA in late 2023. And it stands at the very crux of what this paper seeks to examine. Father Iluia was talking about the ongoing attacks on villages in the diocese, most of them Christian majority villages, as I said, located in Nigeria's Middle Belt. These offensives often involved unarmed villagers being killed by actors carrying AK-type military rifles. The priest rejected narratives that presented such instances as the outcome of herder-farmer tensions, which is a contested and often controversial term in and of itself. So if you hear the term herder-farmer, please imagine it as being in quotation marks. So the narratives present these instances as being the outcome of, as I say, herder-farmer conflicts or climate change-driven eco-violence, rather than interpreting events as a land grab supported by jihadist groups, which was the position taken by this priest. Now, resistance to narratives that locate climate change at the very centre of the current violence in the Middle Belt unites a number of Christian leaders across the denominations. Archbishop Henry C. Ndukuba, the primate of the Church of Nigeria, was equally critical of narratives which stressed climate change as the driver of attacks on Christians in Nigeria. He also focused on the role of extremist groups, and he said, the wrong perception by the Western powers that killings and displacement of Christian communities in the North are a consequence of climate change should be jettisoned. Attention is needed to the international community, to the evidence of a well-organized, well-equipped, and well-funded militia groups operating some parts of central Nigeria with links to Ansaru, Al-Qaeda, and Boko Haram terrorist groups devastating the vulnerable Christian communities. With regards to the Sahel region, Luca Ranieri points out that policy and media discourses suggest that the soaring terrorist violence is linked to, if not driven by, climate change and environmental factors. And they are absolutely correct to highlight the role of the media in promulgating this narrative, as much of this debate is mediated, filtered, and ultimately promulgated through the media. Many of the narratives which have appeared in the media stress the role of climate change in the violence in Nigeria's Middle Belt. A 2017 speech by former government minister Professor Jerry Gana at the University of Lagos's 49th convocation was boiled down by one periodical to herdsman attacks caused by climate change, Gana, despite Professor Gana giving a much more nuanced and wide-ranging talk. Similarly, a 2018 statement by President Buhari's administration spoke of, quote, varied and complex reasons behind the clashes between farmers and herders in the Middle Belt, and while stating climate change had further compounded the problem, it also claimed that there was evidence of some politicians using criminals to perpetrate the killings. Yet, this was boiled down in one news source to, quote, the presidency said on Sunday that the ongoing killings linked to herdsmen are amongst the multifaceted implications of climate change. The UK Guardian in 2021 said that in the past few years, there have been a growing number of skirmishes between farmers and cattle herders searching for pasture and water, which was perhaps an accurate statement if one goes back to the 1970s, but if you look at what's happened over the last decade, it's an oddly naive statement to make, stressing that in the past 2 decades, the climate crisis has contributed to altering that old order, and what used to be a friendly arrangement has become a crisis marked by looting, raids, cattle rustling, and premeditated killings, end quote, is an odd mixture of the outdated and the accurate. Nevertheless, The Guardian does manage to encapsulate some of the factors which have escalated the violence, including the increase in the size of the cattle population, the movement of herders from other countries into Nigeria, and other factors. And it also acknowledges the growing role of terrorist groups in the clashes. But its main theme is very clear, quote, "The climate crisis is the biggest factor driving the tensions," end quote. Such narratives help to drive simplified readings that locate climate change as the main or key driver of the violence in the Middle Belt. And that can help us to understand why, when St. Francis Xavier's church in Ondo State was bombed, the President of Ireland stressed climate change as a driver of the attack. Bishop Jude Arogundade of the Catholic Diocese of Ondo criticised President Michael Higgins after he appeared to equate the driver of the attack on the church, in which 41 people were killed, with, quote, "the consequences of climate change." President Higgins actually said, quote, that such an attack was made in a place of worship is a source of particular condemnation, as is any attempt to scapegoat pastoral peoples, i.e. Fulani herders, who are among the foremost victims of the consequences of climate change. In fact, there was little or no indication that Fulani militants were responsible in any way for that massacre. And Ondo State in Western Nigeria is geographically removed from the Middle Belt where these clashes have been ongoing. Moreover, the militant jihadist group Boko Haram actually claimed responsibility. But despite all of that, the incident was framed by President Higgins within the narrative about climate change driving farmer-herder conflict in the Middle Belt. In his rebuke to the president, Bishop Jude appealed to those who are trying to take advantage of this horrific event to project any form of ideological agenda and called on them to desist from such opportunism. I actually met Bishop Jude in the December following the events, and he was horrified by the fact that the attack in the church in his diocese had been connected to the whole Middle Belt situation and indeed particularly to the climate change narrative. Now, I will briefly look at some of the narrative presentations of the violent offensives against a number of settlements on Christmas Eve 2023. Father Andrew Dewan, the Director of Communications in Pankshin Diocese, where many of the attacks occurred, dismissed any narrative presenting them as a conflict over natural resources, in this case land, with no reference to any religious dimension. He told Aid to the Church in Need that such a narrative was, quote, ludicrous. He also dismissed any idea of this being an extension of herder-farmer clashes. He said, to say that what happened was a clash between farmers and herders is to suggest that only farmers were working on their farms when they were attacked. People were at home. It was the evening. It was Sunday. People don't work on farms on Sunday. 99% of those killed were at home. Some people were killed in their sleep. The idea that this is a conflict that's happening on the land, an immediate conflict between two groups, just doesn't stack up. And Father Andrew was very clear about that. He added that some farmers who went back to their fields following the attacks, quotes, saw Fulani herdsmen destroying their harvest and other food products. Farms and food barns were also burned down. Jalan Mandong, a survivor who lost 10 relatives in the attacks, told Aid to the Church in Need that many of the victims were women and children, and said that the attacks were designed to, quote, target Christians and disrupt the celebration of Christmas, while also attempting to, quote, take over the lands of these communities. So an eyewitness interprets it as a land grab and also believes there is a clear religious dimension to it. But other narratives were put forward for the Christmas 2023 attacks. The Nigerian site Fact Checked Hub privileged the narrative of Kisas Mali, chairman of the Youth Peace Network and Community Peace Observer in Bokos local government area, who said the root cause of the killing of a Fulani herder during Ramadan over a dispute about grazing land had triggered everything. He said the farmer community killed him and 55 of his cows and also attacked his settlement and killed 4 other people. According to him, this incident several months previously led to a cycle of violence which peaked when Kemba Pelly was attacked on the night of the 23rd and morning of the 24th, which was the first attack that saw the beginning of the spiralling of the violence. This led to reprisal attacks on Fulani settlements, which drove the inhabitants out. They then called on other members of the broader Fulani community, leading to the large-scale attacks which we saw. Captain Oya James, the acting spokesperson for Operation Safe Haven, the military task force which is appointed to peacekeep in the region, had a different narrative. He understood the attacks to be connected to Fulani herder encroachment on farmland. He said, I went there on Sunday after the Saturday attacks and was told that the farmers went and grazed in someone's potato farm in that village around the border. So farmers chased the herders out of the farm and later agreed to meet on Sunday to know how much they would pay as compensation. The youth leader in the area said there was an agreement that they were going to meet and discuss the issue of compensation, and unfortunately, the attack happened on Saturday. Mohammed Nuru Abdulli, the Bokos State chairman of the Mayeta Allah Cattle Breeders Association in Nigeria, issued a statement highlighting the unfortunate incident of an early morning attack and killing of several Fulanis, pointing to the deaths of 3 herders during a cattle rustling incident in which bandits tried to seize 181 cows. He rejected any narrative that Fulanis had perpetrated the attacks. He said, we have been hearing a series of accusations that Fulani were behind the attacks on the 24th of December that led to the deaths of residents in Bokos and Arogundade. We make bold to say that what has been happening is an outright act of criminality by unpatriotic Nigerians that are hell-bent on perpetrating criminality. It is worthy of note that the early morning Sunday attacks by security personnel in collaboration with bandits on our members was without any provocation, and it is barbaric. He said 130 Fulani houses were torched in Makada, Matalem, Mondum, Matal, Tanshan, Mekafi, Yelwanono, Fokos, Shoro, and Mofet villages. And at this point, I have to apologise that some of my pronunciation will be wildly inaccurate and some of it will be spot on, largely depending on how well I know the region and the individuals concerned. Plateau State Governor Caleb Muftwang steered a neutral course, as one might expect from a politician, but tellingly, he referred to, quote, unprovoked and simultaneous attacks in different villages which were premeditated and coordinated, and saw these as, quote, a clear case of criminality, insurgency, and terrorism, close quote, even going so far as to describe them as genocide. Often other local officials apparently describe them attacks by bandits. So we are confronted by a number of narratives, two of which claim to identify a root cause in a specific clash between the two communities, albeit a completely different clash. So it's interesting to note three things. One, there are very different emphases in all of these narratives. Two, all of these narratives obviously testify to a tense situation between different communities. While it could potentially be premature to identify any one incident as a trigger, nevertheless, it points to an instability which can easily escalate at any time and which could be easily exploited. Three, that the culprits of the large-scale attacks, which saw more than 100 people killed, are often seen in these narratives as carried out by criminal or terrorist elements and not necessarily by local Fulani herders. Even Kifas Malay's narrative that stresses farmer-herd tensions points to external actors being drawn to the ongoing conflicts and identifies these external actors with the upscaled attacks. Indeed, the most common point of narrative overlap is that there was external criminal involvement, which in some narratives is also described as terrorist. It's also worth hearing Reuter's narrative of the case. I quote, "It was not immediately clear what triggered Sunday's attacks, but violence in the region known as the Middle Belt is often characterized as ethno-religious, chiefly Muslim Fulani herdsmen clashing with mainly Christian farmers. But experts and politicians say climate change and expanding agriculture are creating competition for land, pushing farmers and herders into conflict. Nomadic cattle herders are from northern Nigeria, which is getting drier and becoming more prone to droughts and floods. That is forcing them to trek further south, where farmers are increasing production as the population rapidly expands. That means less land for nomads and their cattle, supporting the view among local people that the conflict is based on the availability of resources rather than ethnic or religious differences." A number of fascinating things to note here. Firstly, to highlight that the climate change narrative is pushed in a very unnuanced way, with no reference to broader contextual factors, which runs the risk of oversimplifying the cause of the violence. Yes, the basic outline is broadly accurate, but what it doesn't say is just as important as what it does say, and what it doesn't say is tellingly, well. Moreover, journalism is supposed to favour statements that can be backed up rather than asserted, but we have this beautiful phrase, the view among local people that the conflict is based on the availability of resources. Now, this phrase is not only a curious assertion, but it's one that's seemingly pulled out of thin air. Let's look at the narrative Reuters has presented. The narrative has gone from experts and politicians claiming that climate change-based resource competition is driving factors, to 4 parts later, locals on the ground saying this. I did not encounter this in my survey responses to the attacks at all. And in the narratives we had above, the closest we have to the trigger for the Christmas attack being about land resources is Captain James's narrative of the cows eating the potato crop. Now, one could suggest that narratives like Kifas Malay's imply climate change-based violence and resource-based competition, but he never actually alleges that the farmer-herder conflict, which is where he seems to be firmly locating the events, is specifically driven by resource competition. So the writers, journalists could be joining the dots, they could be drawing conclusions, or they could be speaking more generally about the current crisis. But even so, such claims from locals are not readily available in the public domain. It's difficult to know how this claim can be justified. And after all, if this is the general local view, why start by stating this is the view of politicians and experts? And let's problematize that claim. If this is the view of local politicians in the region, we must note that the politicians that have gone on record have not applied the climate change narrative to these events. The state governor certainly didn't apply the climate change narrative to these events, so it's difficult to see exactly where this information is coming from. So the writer's extract above, to some extent, reiterates the basic narrative. Climate change has been the trigger of the attacks by pushing greater numbers of Fulani further south. Clashes between Fulani herders in the Middle Belt are then presented as competition for resources, in particular land for grazing cattle. Richard Tiwo's 2023 review article usefully surveys the studies that postulate that the Middle Belt conflicts are primarily a dispute over water and land use. Key theories include Malley and Vernet's hypothesis that harsh climatic conditions, particularly over the past 2 decades, have resulted in the depletion of pastures, leading Fulani herders to migrate to areas more conducive for grazing in the Middle Belt and southern regions. Abuju and Onuba state that the most affected regions were the northeastern ones occupied by Fulani pastoralists, and this narrative, or variations on it, have been advanced by parts of the Nigerian government as part of its meta-narrative. That is the key narrative to explain the violence in the Middle Belt. Now, according to reports, in 2016, the Minister of State, the Minister of State for Agriculture, Heineken Nalok Pobiri, said the problems are, quote, a result of climate change resulting from global warming and desertification, end quote, forcing Fulani herdsmen to migrate southwards to find new pasture for their animals. So some government bodies have signed up to this narrative, even if others have taken a more nuanced view. And certainly in the press, politicians are presented as repeating nothing more than a slight variation on the theme advanced by the academic studies we've referenced in passing. A study published by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute in 2022, while noting the shift over the past decade, and I'll come back to this, this is critical to the whole situation, what's changed in the past decade, while noting this shift from small local clashes to organised militancy among migrant herders, and considering other causes, nevertheless, typically characterises the conflict as ecologically driven, and I quote, the effects of climate change in northern Nigeria, worsening livelihood conditions for migrant herders, changing pastoral mobility patterns towards the Middle Belt region, and weak governance of, quotes, increasingly contested natural resources, have in combination contributed to turning isolated local resource conflicts into broader intercommunal violence. That we hear the same narrative being repeated is not surprising. The study's methodology, quotes, a systematic review of academic literature on climate change and violent conflict in West Africa, highlights how existing literature on the Middle Belt crisis perpetuates certain perspectives, including the climate change narrative. Study after study reiterates this narrative or a close variant. Some, like Odo and Chigozie, draw on eco-violence theory, basing it on the work of Homer Dixon. They anchor the conflict in a struggle over resources, stating, quotes, natural resource scarcity is the immediate cause of Fulani herdsman conflict. Sorry, the Fulani herdsman-farmer conflict, while climate change constitutes the remote cause. When trying to explain the violence in the Middle Belt, academics have been keen to contextualize their own analysis within Homer Dixon's hypothesis that diminishing natural resources can have profound societal consequences, contributing to civil violence. The eco-violence hypothesis has been seized upon by scholars most of whom have perhaps lost much of the nuance of Homer Dixon's original formulation and make climate change a meta-narrative accounting for all aspects of this violence in Nigeria. A succession of academics have advanced statements that use climate change as a meta-narrative. Indeed, one scholar even notes without any attempt at irony that, quotes, the debates on the herder-farmer conflicts in Africa have mostly focused on climatic and structural factors, close quotes. And yet, Homer Dixon himself warns against over or underplaying the role of environmental factors in such conflict, stating, ongoing debate between those who maintain that environmental scarcities play only a minimal role in conflict and those who argue this role is much more significant and who in the process often sensationalize the issue and overstate the contribution of environmental pressures. The answer lies between these two extremes. Indeed, he stresses that environmental scarcity by itself is never a necessary nor sufficient cause. The causes of specific instances of violence are always interacting sets of factors, close quote. Identifying eco-violence, he says, will not be an easy process as, quote, causal processes are exceedingly complex. I'll start that one again, sorry. He says, causal processes are exceedingly complex, involving multiple physical and societal variables. He argues that we must pay very careful attention to the unique contextual factors in each case. Indeed, quote, environmental factors only produce their effects in complex interaction with other societal and physical variables. Points which are often completely lost on those who pay lip service to Homer Dixon but have not read his excellent tome. And if I may, at the possible risk of being slightly uncharitable, my host institution, point out that when I wanted to actually read what Homer Dixon said, I ordered this book secondhand off of, I forget, one of the online sites. It's an excellent book. However, unfortunately, it's a great loss to SOAS, whose library this was removed from, so I could buy it secondhand. This really should be in the SOAS library. People need to read this book. It can be quite difficult to achieve the nuance which Homer Dixon advocates. And we have countless presentations of narratives that reduce the situation to, quotes, climate-related armed conflicts in the region, close quote, driven by, quotes, resource contexts, close quote. The idea is promoted by academics, even those like Alumba, excellent paper by Alumba, who has grasped Homer Dixon's arguments and identifies interacting factors such as political opportunity. It's inspired what he writes. Moreover, taking into account the diverse factors at play, Alumba stresses Homer Dixon's concept of political opportunity, suggesting that the Fulani, perceiving that the structures of power relations surrounding them had changed in its favour following the 2015 electoral results, bringing a Fulani president to power, perceived greater opportunities to address their grievances, leading them to act with more impunity. Alumba suggests they were further encouraged by federal efforts to secure land for Fulani herders through various bills, the RUGA initiative being chief among these. Now, even if such schemes were unpopular among the Fulani herding communities that they were supposed to be supporting, nevertheless, it shows political will to support the group, which is exactly the sort of condition which Homer Dixon suggests could embolden and create political opportunity. Moreover, we should be cautious of too tritely citing climate change as the cause. Madu and Nwankwo's study, focusing on the spatial or precise geographical sites of conflict, challenges the narrative that is resource conflict, pointing to, quote, regions more vulnerable to climate change experiencing lesser farmer-herder conflict. This is another great paper, another one very worth reading. Their modelling found that, quote, vulnerability to climate change decreases the conflict, close quotes, suggesting the basic assertion of a necessary correlation between conflict and resource competition may in fact be incorrect. While not dismissing many of the key findings of other scholars, Madu and Nwankwo nuanced them by stressing the limitations of many of the dominant narrative models and their underlying analysis, while accepting that the herders' migration pattern may have been impacted by climate change. Nevertheless, they state that such migration, quotes, might not necessarily lead to conflict in the host communities in central and southern Nigeria, because migration alone cannot explain the mechanism that produces the conflict. Indeed, this echoes Homer Dixon's point that environmental scarcity cannot solely trigger massive migrations and conflicts. It can only combine with other social, economic, and political factors to generate such an outcome. Indeed, this nuance is not novel in debates about the so-called farmer-herder crisis, and other studies have echoed this point. For Madu and Nwankwo, the challenge in the southward migration pattern cannot adequately account for the conflict developing when the two groups come into contact. So while, quote, migration is important, the mechanism establishing the migration conflict nexus has to be explained by taking cognizance of identity differentials between herding groups and local communities. The issues of identity and belonging can be vital to understanding how the migration of herders engenders conflict with the host communities in central and southern Nigeria. Identity politics is one of the key elements that needs to be factored in, along with others, I hasten to add, in explaining the Middle Belt crisis. According to analysis from the US Institute of Peace, migration is also something of a wild card when it comes to drivers of conflict in Nigeria, and suggests that low economic opportunity, declining social and economic ties, and negative relations between citizens and government are more likely to be key drivers. The same analysis cautions, drawing lines of causation between climate change and conflict requires caution. Every conflict has many causes, Homer Dixon again, and people do not automatically start fighting when the weather heats up, their crops shrivel, or their jobs disappear, end quote. This more nuanced and tentative analysis, although carried out more than a decade ago, takes Homer Dixon's caveats to heart and echoes more recent studies. Furthermore, Madu and Nwankwo's is not the only analysis which has called into question the exact role of climate change in stimulating the conflicts in this part of Africa. With reference to the wide Sahel region, Ranieri points out, quote, despite such a proliferation in policy discourses, the evidence made available by natural and social sciences puts the alleged links between climate variability, environmental degradation, and conflict in the Sahel into question. The connection between the two is less straightforward than is often claimed. Scholarly attempts to draw automatic correlations between environmental variables and conflicts, let alone terrorism, have so far yielded inconclusive results. Citing evidence suggesting that the Sahelian strip south of the Sahara is actually greening, Ranieri suggests that narratives that favour climate change have practical utility, this is a great quote, providing local governments with a narrative that depoliticizes conflicts and downplays their own responsibilities, meaning political groups have a vested interest in maintaining these narratives and keeping them at the forefront of the debate. Indeed, as Ojo has pointed out, from the beginning of such analyses of the conflicts, there has been no consensus as to whether or not there is a causal connection between climate change and armed conflict in the region. While there is suggestive evidence, there is not yet proof positive that climate change has played a role in precipitating the current crisis. Any analysis and resultant narrative, I would suggest, needs to listen to the voices coming from those communities which have suffered in order to produce a more comprehensive picture of events. Church sources in particular, which are those that I'm personally more familiar with, have stressed a shift from the mid-2010s onwards. Speaking to Aid to the Church in 2018, Archbishop Ignatius Kaigama, then of Jos in Plateau State, which has been one of the two states to have suffered sustained violence, spoke of this change. He said, recently, herdsmen have developed a kind of new audacity to invade and destroy farmers' crops. In the past, there were problems between the two groups, but they were not that frequent. He identified military-grade weaponry as adding a new dimension to the attacks. Quote continues, even the president of our country, then Muhammad Buhari, also recognises that the Fulani we knew before only carried sticks and cutlasses to cut leaves to feed their animals. Now, those who destroy people's crops are carrying sophisticated weapons, and that includes AK-type rifles. This tallied with reports from Tabara Estates 2 months before, where Remasikiwe Kama, chairman of the local council, told the Financial Times, "The herdsmen come with machine guns. They are killers. They are not the herdsmen we knew." Indeed, it is also worth noting that in 2016, roughly at the beginning of the escalation of violence, authorities, including the Sultan of Sokoto, Al-Hajj Sa'ad Abu Bakr III, were stating that those responsible were not Nigerian herders, but rather foreign-born herders. An Amnesty International report published in 2018 also stressed local perspectives on the recent change in the nature of the attacks. Those interviewed in farming communities said harmonious relationships and peaceful coexistence had existed in the past. They explained how beneficial living together had been and how families from both sides visited and interacted with each other. A 65-year-old farmer in Kanakon village, Ondo State, said prior to the attack on the 19th of February 2017 that resulted in 9 deaths, "We were all living in peace. There was a cordial relationship. They always came here, and if not for their facial marks and looks, you would not know that they were Fulani, because they watched films with us and ate with us." Interviewees said there were occasional conflicts over cattle grazing on farmlands, but these were amicably resolved either by the people themselves or by the village heads. Amnesty stated that it believes the methods of attack carried out largely by men, including the weapons used, not only show the level of organisation and coordination, but also intent to cause serious harm and destruction. The narratives from a number of survivors of more recent attacks have also stressed an Islamist cast to the instance. The UK All-Party Parliamentary Group on Freedom of Religion or Beliefs report on Nigeria stated, "The APPG received numerous reports that Christian pastors and community heads are specifically targeted. During many of the attacks, the herders are reported by survivors to have shouted, 'Allahu Akbar,' 'Destroy the infidels,' and 'Wipe out the infidels.' Hundreds of churches have been destroyed, including over 500 churches in Benue State. As the Bishop of Truro concluded in his report on the UK's Foreign and Commonwealth Office," and this is a quote from the Bishop of Truro's report, "the religious dimension is a significantly exacerbating factor in clashes between farmers and herders and," again quoting the Bishop of Truro's report, "targeted violence against Christian communities in the context of worship suggests that religion plays a key part." Summaries of first-hand testimonies then follow in the report. These demonstrate a pattern of attacks which reflects exactly what's said above. And to give just one example from another source, during that spate of attacks around Christmas 2023, the Reverend Gideon Dowell was with a vigilante group in Kambapeli when he heard the approaching attackers shouting, "Allah Akbar." Again, a similar sort of pattern to what we've seen before. Moreover, there is mounting evidence from US intelligence that bandit groups are working with Boko Haram cells, which has been passingly referenced in some academic studies. Not all the data is publicly available, and much of it is still contested. For example, Michael Nawankpa concedes that there is, quotes, "evidence of a strategic marriage convenience between Sheku's faction of Boko Haram and certain Fulani-led criminal groups in northern Nigeria, but believes the group's ties are, quote, weak and transactional in nature," end quote. Like many areas of this conflict, this is one where we are still not in possession of enough data to draw any sure conclusions about the exact nature of the links between the Fulani militants and established jihadist networks in the country. But that does not mean that such links should therefore be ignored or written off. We have seen that international terrorist groups seeking to co-opt pastoralist communities for terrorist gain in a number of countries, a number of regions in Nigeria. We could mention Daesh, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda in Mali, but we could also mention Boko Haram in Nigeria carrying out a similar strategy. And there is a study published by the Danish Institute of International Studies, which reiterates that. Now, we must be very careful and nuanced in what we say. Fulani herders do not constitute a single homogeneous group. And While on one hand, we can point to US intelligence evidence that Boko Haram has trained Fulani insurgents, on the other hand, Boko Haram killed 90 members of the Fulani herder community in December 2019, just outside Fue village near Nagala, close to the border with Cameroon. On one hand, narratives that would completely identify Boko Haram and Fulanis as one united, organized Islamist drive for territorial gain are completely untenable. But on the other hand, the lived experience of Christian villages which have been attacked must be carefully weighed. They are targeted. The attackers spout Christian Islamists, the churches are targeted, the attackers spout Islamist slogans, and calendar dates for attacks seem to be chosen with significance to Christianity, i.e. on Sundays or around major festivals. The presence of jihadist ideology in at least some Fulani herder attacks cannot be easily dismissed. Yet, religion may not be the key factor driving these attacks, or even attracting members of the Fulani community to radical religion. As we've seen in other countries, a number of factors, including poverty, illiteracy, youth unemployment, a lack of access to resources, separatist movements, and pre-existing intercommunal violence has led to the growth of radicalization in sub-Saharan Africa, and we've also seen it driving a huge explosion in militancy, in Islamist militancy in Mali. But the driver isn't religious radicalization, it's all these other factors which are pushing disaffected young people into the arms of the radicals. The evidence is that there is links, that there is evidence that there are links between parts of the Fulani herder community and Islamist insurgents, and the problems the community has faced make its members ripe for radicalization, while social factors rather than religious extremism is almost certainly the key factor. Nevertheless, we have indicators that jihadist radicalization has taken root within parts of the Fulani herder community, and particularly those parts of the community carrying out the more brutal attacks in the Middle Belt, which have targeted Christians. As Ojo notes, quote, armed groups, ethnic militias, and jihadist extremists have exploited such vulnerabilities to recruit from the vulnerable communities affected by the climate-induced drought, although one might stress that climate is only part of a smorgasbord of factors involved. Now, how to sum up and try and make some notes towards conclusion to all of this. When there is a substantial mismatch between the narratives provided by the affected communities and those relied upon by academics, politicians, and other key interpreters like the media, there is a fundamental problem that needs addressing. That's not to say that we must uncritically accept every narrative put forward by a victim just because it comes from a victim, but when attacked communities repeatedly supply narratives in which aggressors mouth religious slogans and target churches and so forth, as explored above, it is deeply inadequate to rely on a narrative which presents climate change as the main driver of such attacks. Homer Dixon stresses the interplay of different elements in triggering what he calls eco-violence, and we need to grasp the great breadth of these factors in prolonging, promulgating, and exacerbating the Middle Belt crisis. There are numerous factors which have had different impacts throughout the process of the escalating violence. Fulani herders have lost traditional grazing lands due to climate change. This has led them to abandon the established Bertie system of routes, which was, at the time, mutually agreed between all parties. The extension of the Fadama cultivation by farmers has meant that land once used for grazing is now employed for crop growth all year round, which means it can't be used for grazing out of season. Combine this with the collapse of traditional dispute resolution mechanisms, all of this has increased tensions between the groups. While the exact reasons for the shift to the new phase of conflict around 2016 are still poorly understood, other relevant factors seem to involve increasing economic hardship among Fulani herders, particularly precipitated by factors such as poor dairy sales in the north, anti-grazing laws, and the increased availability of firearms. But, as Prophecy Moses Yamusa stresses, these latter factors are, quote, not sufficiently explored. Again, we have some evidence, but it hasn't been plumbed. We haven't explored it. We can't give definite conclusions or say that we have proof positive of any of this. And one might add to this list of factors the failure of political initiatives to address growing tensions, such as the highly controversial National Livestock Transformation Plan. Radicalization fostered by growing links between parts of the Fulani herder community and jihadist movements also appears to be part of a perfect storm which has led to the Middle Belt crisis. The latter must be contextualized with existing religio-ethnic tensions within the region. In the past, religion has been used to exacerbate existing identity politics in northern Plateau State between so-called settlers, the Fulani coming in from the north, and indigenes, the Barom, the Anaguta, and the Afeziri. And these are just broad brushstrokes, which one must necessarily drill down into, but lack of data in some areas makes this a difficult process. But that doesn't mean we should just say it's all climate change. So, does the current crisis represent the targeting of Christians, as some local narratives from attacked communities seems to indicate? Long-standing complexities in the local situation, including the economic problems affecting Fulani herders and overlapping religious and ethnic identities mentioned above, problematize any interpretation of these attacks solely as an expression of animus against Christian identity, and I would stress solely. I think it's a factor, but I don't think it's the only factor. Additionally, an almost ubiquitous lack of comprehensive data on the Middle Belt attacks and the insurgents' own understanding of the reasons for their attacks hinders any in-depth analysis. However, despite these limitations, there has clearly been observable surge in various forms of hostility perpetrated, particularly in Benue and Plateau states, ostensibly carried out by members of the Fulani herder community. And there are certain characteristics of the attacks on Christian settlements and IDP camps that need to be accounted for. For example, the attacks timed to coincide with Christian feasts or holy days. If these characteristics are ignored, there is both the risk that the nature of the attacks will be poorly understood, with religion being removed from the equation due to perceptual bias on the part of those undertaking the analysis, and on a more personal level, victims who have suffered because of these attacks and as a direct result of them perceive that they were targeted because they are Christians will feel that their experiences and voices are being ignored. And we mustn't let that happen. We must listen to the victims. We must at least factor in their experience to our understanding. It would be fair to give some credence to positions like those of Efevutu and Ihuoma, who maintain that the root causes of these attacks still remain largely shrouded in mystery, inasmuch as no one has sat down with those responsible for the attacks and recorded their rationale, their perspective for what's happening in the Middle Belt. Some people have spoken to Fulani herders about clashes, but these have never been the Fulani herders with the AK-47s driving in on motorbikes, driving in on large military-type vehicles. It's been the normal rank and file Fulani who have been spoken to, and they are obviously not the key drivers of the attacks on the Christian majority settlements. And the fact that we have evidence that Fulani have been attacked also suggests that there is a bigger dimension to this that is being ignored. Indeed, USER, the United States Commission for International Religious Freedoms, 2024 report states, quote, "The specific perpetrators of a motivation behind individual attacks are often difficult to verify." However, I would suggest that if we look at the evidence, we can begin to offer a more complex analysis informed by Homer Dixon's frameworks, which both challenges reductivist narratives that overstress climate change and resource competition, but also offer the groundwork of a more nuanced and accurate, if partly speculative narrative. The new narrative would have weakness. Of course it would. All these narratives have weaknesses, but it would provide a better fit with the complex causality and the overlooked survivors' narratives, which are currently not being factored in. Any such narrative would have to admit that environmental scarcity is an underlying stress, to use Homer Dixon's term, which has interacted with political, economic, and other factors to, again, as Homer Dixon would say, generate harsh social effects that in turn help to reduce violence. Dwindling resources resulting from the effects of climate change do seem to have played a role in the problems in the Middle Belt as a driver of herder migration away from traditional grazing routes, starting in the 1970s and exacerbated and increased the frequency of existing clashes between pastoralists and farmers as grazing lands began to be impacted. However, this must always be just one part of a far more complex mosaic. In particular, a more nuanced narrative must stress the changes in the conflict which were seen around a decade ago. We have seen attackers armed with high-grade military guns driving out farming communities. This is an entirely new dimension of the problem. It's not adequate to merely repeat the root causes of the older conflicts as though they account for the new situation. And we have to look at all the causes I've been speaking about today, and it may well be that the new developments were partly precipitated by the involvement of pan-national criminal networks with links to jihadist movements. But new factors were responsible for this shift, and this new phase of violence, and these must be understood if we are to account for the current situation. Homer Dixon says that climate change in and of itself is never a sufficient explanation, and it's not. There is a lot more we need to take into account. So I'd like to finish with two quotes, which bring us back to our core focus. The first is from Janania Vivekananda. It's not just the Nigerian names I have problems with, I do apologize. The head of climate diplomacy and security of the German think tank Adelphi. Climate change didn't cause this conflict, but it is compounding existing dimensions of the conflict. The second is from Father Remigius. We opened with him. It's only fair we should close with him. He was speaking to Aid to the Church Need after militants killed Christian farmer Agba Tagba in Gwere West local government area. And he said, one of the things that I would love us to do, if there's a possibility, is to break the ice of political correctness. As long as we keep saying this is about climate change, these elements, by which he meant other factors, particularly religious elements, will keep hiding and keep inflicting injuries on people. Thank you.
Well, I will stop the recording here, and that means that you're more than welcome to ask questions.